I don't believe it. You saw her in the painting, Grandma?
Many times. But the peculiar thing was that little Erica kept on changing her position in the picture. So one day she'd be feeding the ducks.
One of my favorite things to do at the pond is to feed the ducks and geese.
Fuck off!
Roald Dahl was born on the 13th of September 1916 in Cardiff, Wales. During his service in the Second World War as a fighter pilot and then an intelligence officer, Dahl published his first works in 1942 entitled A Piece of Cake, which was about his wartime experiences. Shortly after, in 1943, Dahl wrote his first children's book, The Gremlins, which was about mysterious little creatures sabotaging RAF aircrafts in wartime Britain. The 1984 film of the same name hailed the book as an influence for the creatures, but the story, characters, and setting were entirely different. Throughout the 20th century, Dahl wrote a number of successful short stories for adults which were humorous, dark, and featured surprising plot twists. A collection of his short stories, Tales of the Unexpected, were adapted into a TV series of the same name and quickly became popular. On top of his success as an author whose stories appealed to grown-ups, Roald Dahl was probably most famous for his children's books, most of which were adapted for film. I've written about Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, the musical from 1971 starring Gene Wilder, and actually is probably the cheeriest film that has come from material by Roald Dahl that I've seen. I say that because a common trait in most of Roald Dahl's children's stories is an element of darkness that is probably why I liked Roald Dahl's stories when I was a kid. The Witches is a prime example. The story centres around 8-year-old American boy Luke Eversham, who is visiting his grandmother Helga at her home in Norway. Growing up, Luke's grandmother has told him stories about witches, what they look like, how to spot them, and some of the unpleasant things that they've done to children in the past. The darkness of this story comes in when, in a short space of time, Luke's parents are killed in a car crash and Helga is diagnosed with a mild case of diabetes.
Diabetes.
Thank you, Wilford. Diabetes.
The two decide to take a vacation to the English coast at a nice, smart hotel. Whilst at the hotel, Luke accidentally happens upon a meeting of the NSPCC. These ladies are actually witches who have been summoned by the Grand High Witch, who unleashes her ultimate plan to wipe out the children of England, which is to have the witches buy sweet shops and then give away free candies to the children, only for the candies to be laced with a formula that will turn the children into mice. The idea is that children's parents will kill the mice unaware that they are their children, but this detail was left out of the film. The screenplay was written by Scottish screenwriter Alan Scott, and this man seemed to have a good relationship with director Nicholas Roeg, since 5 of Scott's screenplays were directed by him, including The Witches. The early scenes at Grandma's house were filmed in Bergen, Norway, but the majority of the film was shot on location at the Headland Hotel in Newquay, Cornwall, which was renamed Hotel Excelsior for the purposes of the film. The casting of the Grand High Witch seemed to be something of a stumper for the producers, as 15 quite high-profile actresses were considered for the role. The most high-profile include Cher, Sigourney Weaver, Susan Sarandon, and Jodie Foster. Eventually, the role went to American actress Angelica Houston, who was Roald Dahl's personal favourite for the role. The meeting scene in the ballroom where the witches all unmask is probably the most visually stunning sequence, especially the design of the Grand High Witch. The makeup applied to Houston was elaborate and took 6 hours to apply, as well as another 6 hours to take off. What is interesting is that Houston had this huge monologue to make, but she does have a false set of grotesque teeth put in. Her audio is also not echoed as it should be, since she's standing at the end of a huge ballroom. I suspect that she spoke the lines in the scene and then went back and spoke over her lines in a sound booth in post-production.
Yes!
Is that it?
Yes?
Right.
Also, in the shots that pan down the row of seats to show the witches without their wigs, the audience can see that some of the witches are played by men.
It is man!
Let's talk about the differences. The Grand High Witch's personal assistant, Miss Irvine, played by Jane Horrocks, was an invention for the film. Originally, Helga was diagnosed with pneumonia, but in the film, she's diagnosed with a mild case of diabetes. In the book, the boy didn't have a name and he was British, but in the film, he's called Luke and he's American. Book Helga was a retired witch hunter, but film Helga tells Luke that she searched the world for the Grand High Witch, but never found her. Later in the hotel dining area, Helga recognises the Grand High Witch, and the Grand High Witch seems to recognise her. Speaking of dining, in the book, Luke pours Formula 86 into the pot of green pea soup, but in the film, it's cress soup. The book and the film have minor differences, but the basic plot structure follows the same path. all up until the ending. The book through and through has a rather dark tone, and the ending continues that theme. After Luke and Helga have defeated the witches in England, they formulate a plan to rid the world of witches. Helga reminds Luke that since he is a mouse, he will likely only live for another 9 years, but Luke is okay with that since he doesn't want to outlive his grandmother because he doesn't want anyone else looking after him. The ending of the film is a little happier. Miss Irvine, having been disillusioned to the Grand High Witch's plan due to constant beratement, misses the dinner so doesn't turn into a mouse, therefore escapes with her life. She decides that she's going to be a good witch from now on, and her first act of redemption is to turn Luke back into a little boy. Roald Dahl hated the new ending and wanted the ending to stay true to the book. Apparently Nicholas Roeg did film the ending relating to the book as a gesture of conciliation. However, when the film was screened for test audiences, they preferred the ending where Luke is turned back into a boy, so that was the ending they went with. Dahl already wasn't happy with the other changes, but the ending was the final straw. Dahl threatened to launch a publicity campaign to discourage people from watching the film, but after an intervention by executive producer Jim Henson, no further action was taken. The Witches was released in the United States on the 25th of May 1990 and in the UK on the 24th of August 1990. Sadly, the film was a financial failure, taking in just over $15 million. However, critics and the audience praised the film. Even Roger Ebert liked it, so it couldn't have been that bad. Roald Dahl passed away on the 23rd of November 1990, just 3 months after the UK release of The Witches. Jim Henson also passed away in the same year, with The Witches credited as the last film that he personally oversaw. Apparently, next year there will be a remake of this movie and will be co-written and directed by Robert Zemeckis, who directed the Back to the Future films. The performers set to star are Anne Hathaway, Octavia Spencer, Stanley Tucci, and Chris Rock. Zemeckis is a very talented director, so we'll see what he can do with this adaptation. It's already an interesting cast, and whilst I don't think it will be as dark as the original film, Guillermo del Toro is producing, so we'll see.
Diabetes.